Thank you very much. In Japanese Buddhism, in those temples, royalties became priests. And as you have seen in the picture, there are lots of delightful ornaments and various culture are all in the temples, as you have seen. As for Hibino Sunim, I have stayed in Japan for myself for 10 years, and I haven't been able to see much nuns, but I have been able to hear how many nuns have, what kind of efforts they have done to get ordained, and it was a very precious time for me. For questions, we will have to wait until the end. Next will be Professor Monika Schrimpf and also Midorikawa Myosei. And Professor Monika Schrimpf will be talking about Buddhist ordained women in modern and contemporary Japan.
Good. So before I start with my presentation, I would also like to say that I'm really very happy and honored to be invited to this conference and have the opportunity to meet so many fascinating and interesting people. I already learned a lot only this day, so thank you for letting me part of it. And I'll start with my presentation, and then Midorikawa-san will follow and bring some color into it. Maybe another thing I'd like to mention is that my presentation differs from the others one in various ways. I mentioned, for one thing, my perspective is like that of Monika Bethe, one from the outside. I'm not an ordained woman myself, so I look at the topic from a scholar's perspective. And maybe that's the reason why my presentation is probably the one with the least photographs. You all had so many nice pictures we could look at, and I don't have many pictures, so I differ in this sense. But okay, let's start. And also, I will read my paper, because if I talk, then I'm going to move my head, and also it will be very difficult for the interpreter, I think. And this thing, I have to point it to the computer. In my paper, I want to introduce main events, developments, and discourses affecting the situation of ordained women in modern and contemporary Japan, that is, from the Meiji era up to today. One major event contributing to the particular characteristics of modern Japanese Buddhism is the laicization of the clergy in 1872 and 1873. It is significant in two ways. For one thing, the legalization of clerical marriage, meat-eating, grown hair, and non-clerical clothing marks the turning point towards a clergy whose members may live like lay people, yet maintain the status of a cleric. This situation entails many psychological and practical problems, not only for married priests and their spouses, but also for the Buddhist institutions. It also led to a heterogeneity of clerical ways of living and activities rather than standardized modes of monastic life. For another, with the edicts concerning clerical marriage and eat-meeting, Nikujiki Saitai, the state withdrew from any interference with internal Buddhist affairs, thus leaving issues such as administrative organization. Oh, sorry. How did that happen? I'm still there. Sorry. Leaving issues such as administrative, organization, institutional structures, ordination, requirements, and training programs to each Buddhist school. Thus, the heterogeneity of modern clerical lives is intensified by school-specific discourses and gender politics. So, in the following, I will give a general overview on the situation of Buddhist women since modern times. The first part of the paper is dedicated to the decrees mentioned above and their effects, whereas the second part introduces some basic conditions of becoming and being a nun in contemporary Japan. The final part brings together voices of 6 ordained women concerning contemporary discourses about clerical marriage and the role of a cleric. Several terms designate Buddhist ordained women. Josei Kyoshi, that is literally female teacher, denotes the status of a fully ordained female priest. Josei Soryo includes also those women who have received the ordination, tokudo, but not completed the requirements to become a full cleric. Niso, or nun, is the Japanese translation of the Sanskrit bhikshuni. Nowadays, Niso is mostly used to refer to celibate women with a shaved head. But that's just the usage. There's no standardized translation. In historical research, the word Niso refers to officially and privately ordained women who in ancient and medieval times were not necessarily fully tonsured. Beside Niso, the term bhikkhuni is used as a phonetic adaptation of the Sanskrit term bhikshuni. Different to Niso, bhikkhuni describes those ordained women who have received the 348 precepts of the Gusokukai, that is, the Vinaya precepts for women that were already mentioned in the talk this morning. In this paper, I will use the term ordained woman as equivalent for Josei Kyoshi, for all fully ordained women, irrespective of whether they are married or not, and nun as equivalent for Niso to indicate celibate women. In addition, I apply the term female priest or head priest for Jushoku or Yakuso, for ordained women who head or work in a temple and provide ritual services for parishioners or visitors. Cleric is used as a translation of Soryo for all those who have received at least the ordination, but they may or may not have completed the whole training. Now I come to the laicization of the clergy since 1872 and 73. The politics of the new Meiji government changed the situation of Buddhist temples, of monks, and of nuns fundamentally. A modern nation-state was created in the wake of the Meiji Restoration, which in 1868 re-established the Tenno as the head of the state and legitimized his political authority by his divine descent as the ancestor of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Based on this ideology, the situation of all religions, that is Buddhism, Shinto, new religions, Christianity, changed dramatically. Shinto was redefined as a kind of national cultic system, the so-called state Shinto. All Shinto shrines were classified in a comprehensive and hierarchical system, and Shinto priests became government officials. The entanglement of Buddhist and Shinto places, teachings, and practices that had existed until the Meiji era was dissolved, and in 1868, the strict separation of Buddhism and Shinto was decreed, Shimbutsubundi. In some areas, as in the domain Mito, these edicts led to massive attacks on Buddhist temples and the forced laicization of Buddhist priests, which is called Haibutsu-kishaku Undo. At the same time, the Buddhist and Shinto clergy was deprived of their privileges. These measures were not necessarily intended to be anti-Buddhist. Rather, they were part of the attempt to break up the pre-modern class system and to integrate Buddhist clerics into the mass of national subjects, which was a new concept of subjects. In order to achieve this goal, the following decrees were issued. On May 31st, 1872, the Grand Council of State legalized clerical marriage by male priests. I quote, "From now on, Buddhist clerics shall be free to eat meat, marry, grow their hair, and so on. Furthermore, they are permitted to wear ordinary clothing when not engaged in religious activities." End of quote. In October 1872, the Grand Council of State proclaimed that all Buddhist clerics must adopt a surname and register it with the government. Up to the Meiji era, Buddhist clerics had abandoned their secular name and surname if they had one, as well as their birth status upon ordination. On January 22nd, 1873, these regulations concerning clerical marriage of ordained men were extended to Buddhist nuns. I quote, "From now on, nuns may freely grow their hair, eat meat, marry, and return to lay life. Furthermore, those who return to lay life should notify the ward registrar after re-entering a household registry." Whereas ordained men had simply been allowed to get married, this decree encourages ordained women to return to a lay status should they get married. This is the first indication of a double standard with regard to the marriage of ordained men and women, and probably one reason why Buddhist nuns tended not to get married even after the decrees were issued. With these regulations, all privileges pertaining to the status of the clergy were dissolved. Ordination was no longer officially recognized, but became a private affair of the various Buddhist schools. Is my voice too loud? Okay, thank you. The legalization of clerical marriage had a huge impact on the Buddhist clergy, both monks and nuns. With the exception of the Jodo Shinshu, in which priests could get married since the time of its founder, Shinran, the marriage of fully ordained clerics was a violation of the precepts bestowed at ordination. Although priests have had wives, consorts, and families before the Meiji era, these families had never been officially recognized. After the decrees were issued, Buddhist intellectuals and the chief priest of most Buddhist schools strongly protested against this law. At the same time, intradenominational communication emphasized that the Buddhist precepts were as effective as before, since the state had simply entrusted ordination regulations to each school rather than interfering. However, by the beginning of the 20th century, resistance against clerical marriage had subsided, and the system of mainly patrimonial temple inheritance had spread. According to Richard Jaffe, by 1973, the majority of the male Buddhist clergy had married. For more recent times, Paula Adai, in her ethnographic study on contemporary nuns in the Zen Buddhist Sotoshu, claims that most ordained men of this school decided to live as householder priests, whereas most ordained women live as renouncers in order to maintain the monastic tradition established by Dogen. However, to my knowledge, no current and comprehensive statistics exist that allow to compare the number of married ordained women to that of married ordained men, although it would be interesting to have these numbers. Next, I'll talk about the training to become a nun, but very shortly. Each Buddhist school has its own training program for becoming a cleric. Still, there are common elements, such as 1. The ordination, tokudo, under the supervision of an ordained teacher. 2. The theoretical, that is the doctrinal and historical education, which is offered in study programs at the universities and educational institutions of each Buddhist school. In addition, specific classes that can be attended after work or at the weekend are also offered for employed ordinants. 3. The most important part is the practical training, in which the ritual skills of each Buddhist school are taught, the so-called shugyo or kekyo, which Hibino-san just mentioned. It takes place in particular training temples, often in the precincts of each school's head temples, and in some cases includes ascetic practices such as continuous prostrations. This was also already mentioned, the Gotai Toji, you mentioned it. So different schools have different amount of ascetic practices. And 4th, equally important is the bestowal of the precepts, which usually takes place at the ordination tokudo. An exception to this pattern are the Pure Land Buddhist schools of Jodo Shinshu. In Jodo Shinshu Hongan-jiha and Shinshu Otaniha, the two biggest schools, most of the theoretical and practical training takes place before the tokudo. Besides, no precepts are bestowed upon ordination, because here priesthood is defined in a way that is very close to the lay status. In most schools, the training of nuns takes place at the same temples where monks are trained, partly even together. For example, the Nichiren Buddhist training temple Shingyo Dojo has 3 training periods per year, 2 for men and 1 for women. In general, the training is said to be the same for women and for men. However, some ascetic practices cannot be done by women because there are no female supervisors, and they cannot be done together with men. Some schools also have specific training centers for nuns. These are, for example, the Nichiren Shu Nishu Shugakurin, the Aichi Senmon Nisodo in Nagoya of Soto Zen, the Teniji Nishu Senmon Dojo in Gifu of Rinzai Shu Myosei, and the Koyasan Senshu Gakuin Nisobu in Koyasan. The training at these specific centers is usually longer than the conventional time period. Unfortunately, I could not obtain any information about the number of nuns living there, nor about the training in these places, with the exception of the Nisogakuin of Koyasan Shingonshu. A graduate of this training center told me that the intensive 1-year training for nuns included specific tasks for women beside the obligatory Shirokekyo practice. These were the sewing and repairing of robes, the decoration of the temple halls and altars, tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and dancing. The ratio of female and male priests reveals a striking dominance of ordained men. The percentage of ordained women ranges between 2.5% in the Zen Buddhist Rinzai Shu Myosei school and 19.5% in Jodoshinshu Hongan-jiha. So there are ordained women in Soto Shu, but not very many. I will not read the numbers, you also have them in the printed version. Instead, I'll come to the third part, the contemporary issues and ordained women's voices. In the following, I'd like to introduce some opinions expressed by ordained women of Soto Shu, Koyasan Shingonshu, Nichiren Shu, and Jodo Shu concerning the issue of clerical marriage and role of a cleric. The quotes are based on my interviews with ordained women or taken from their publications. It should be noted that in accordance with qualitative social scientific research methods, I present these voices in order to illustrate the range and the variety of role interpretations among ordained women, depending on individual circumstances. They are not to be considered as being representative in a quantitative sense, so each opinion stands for itself. A very clear stance against clerical marriage is voiced by Aoyama Shundo, head of the Soto Shu Convent and Training Center Aichi Senmon Nisodo. In her eyes, someone who is married cannot be a world renouncer. Since most male priests are married, she argues, in present-day Japan, nuns are those who maintain the monastic tradition of world renunciation. She thinks that a cleric should not have a family, because then he or she will care about children and wife or about economic issues rather than giving up this kind of life as Buddha Shakyamuni did. I quote, "Nowadays, Japanese Buddhism has declined, but Shakyamuni's teachings cannot vanish. We must turn to America and Europe and without fail transmit the Buddhist law there. Or even in Japan, turn to those who are seeking. I feel that we are lost were it not for the nuns who don't have families, who are committed and struggle to maintain the monastic life." In today's Buddhist world, which is characterized by the strong decline of the final days of Buddhism, in this situation it is unavoidable that nuns must carry the responsibility to transmit the Buddhist law to America and Europe and to the next generation in Japan. End of quote. In her eyes, the future of Japanese Buddhism depends on nuns because clerical marriage has become the norm among male priests. Her view is strongly influenced by Dogen, founder of the Soto Zen in Japan, and his emphasis on the relevance of monastic rules. A very different opinion is expressed by Goto Asuka, an ordained woman of Koyasan Shingonshu, who is married and has an adult daughter. She is connected to a temple she occasionally supports in its ritual practice, works as an illustrator, and has published several books in which she explains the meaning of Buddhas and deities for everyday life. In contrast to Aoyama Shundo, she praises the flexibility, the junansa, of Japanese Buddhism that differentiates it from other forms of Buddhism in Asia. I quote, "Well, for a cleric of Japanese Buddhism, there's a lot of flexibility. This is also quite hard. After all, I am moving at the bottom of the Japanese Buddhist world. But I really believe that this flexibility is something we Japanese Buddhists can be proud of. We can get married and have a family and thus understand the sufferings of normal people. If we don't know them, we teach and uphold nothing but an ideal. And once we are asked whether we could really live up to the ideal if we had children, a family, and the same kind of problems, we have no idea at all." End of quote. These opinions reflect the extreme ends of a scale. The closeness to ordinary people, which is raised by Goto as an argument in favor of marriage, indicates a kind of grassroots Buddhism which addresses everyday problems rather than focusing on rituals and doctrinal studies. So there's always some kind of hidden criticism in these statements. Whereas in Aoyama's case, the distinction between lay Buddhists and clergy is essential. In Goto's opinion, the blurring of this boundary is viewed positively as a means to reach out to people. A third attitude is expressed by Kageyama Myoe, a Nichiren Buddhist ordained woman who is married to the head priest of a temple in Kamogawa. She's the sub-head priest herself and has raised 3 children. For her, it is of vital importance to separate family life and temple life. I quote, "She also offers Ayurveda treatment in her temple, as you can see. This is my personal conviction, but I think this place here, the temple, is a place for the life of a world renouncer. A family should not live here, not in the temple. This is a training temple, dojo, not a place where a family could live. It is a place for the life of clerics. Because it should be a dojo, our house is someplace else, and I raised the children there. This way, whenever someone comes and wants to stay overnight, that's possible. And I can provide food, and formal events can take place at any time." End of quote. This idea of separate spaces reflects the position of someone who is a committed priest, yet at the same time a devoted mother and wife. In a similar way, all opinions introduced here mirror the living circumstances and agency of each person. Aoyama Shundo as head of a convent, and Goto Asuka as a kind of freelance ordained woman. The next issue I'd like to address is the simple question, what is the role of a cleric in contemporary times, which I thought is a very important question, especially given this diversity. Each ordained woman's living circumstances affect her agency in a different way. Some things are enabled and other things are prevented. Given this diversity, I wondered whether the understanding of a cleric's role would differ and whether it would be perceived in a gender-specific way. Interestingly, my question as to what the role or the purpose, the yakume, of a cleric is, was addressed by referring to 3 different dimensions. The normative dimension, or the ideal image of a cleric, which is considered to be the same regardless of gender. The second dimension is that of experience. It refers to the experience of the ways in which the social environment approaches ordained women, or the expectations they are facing in the society. This dimension was often described as gender-specific. Actually, it was nearly almost described as gender-specific. And third, the dimension of individuality indicates personal definitions of one's own role as a cleric that are deduced from individual skills, inclinations, or living circumstances. The normative dimension describes the role of a cleric in general, or on a macro level, as one female priest put it. 2 characteristics were regarded as essential for the clerical role. For one thing, clerics are described as mediators, hashiwatashi, be it between this world and the other world, or between Buddhas and gods and human beings. A term that is often used in these conceptions is tsunagu, or to connect. In the case of Goto Asuka, it denotes the inherent connection between every human being and the Buddhas and gods, and the constant support by these transcendent beings. A connection most people have to be made aware of by Buddhist clerics. In the case of Jodoshu female priest Oshima Shushi, who is sub-head priest of a temple in Tokyo, Tsunagu is used in the sense of connecting this world and the other world by teaching Buddhist thoughts and ideals. In both cases, ordained people are seen as experts of the other world, which, however, is understood slightly differently. For another, the general role of a cleric is described in terms of an attitude and practice of selflessness that entails being empathetic and supportive, sharing people's sufferings and helping them to overcome them. Here's a quote by the Oshima Shushi. You know her, I think. I already quoted. To grow fond of sick people, to share their sufferings and explain the Buddhist teachings to them, to join in their sorrows. We are like supervisors, and this is something like our motto. Raising the voices of the voiceless, replying for those who cannot reply, I think this is a cleric's task. Ultimately, it means practicing the Bodhisattva virtues until you turn into Bodhisattva canon yourself. That's it. It is the practice of a Bodhisattva. The task of a cleric is the practice of a Bodhisattva. End of quote. Other ordained women expressed a similar attitude of selfless support in other terms, such as practice of compassion, jihi no jisen, standing by someone, yoriso, or listening with an open mind. Soto Zen priest Ijima Kedo emphasizes the priority of realizing this attitude as the ultimate intention of rituals over their merely formal performance. I quote, "The role of a cleric is to support in times of suffering. I think that's the role of a cleric. It is the practice of compassion. In my opinion, rituals and funerary rites serve this practice, but nowadays ritual performance has taken the lead and rituals become empty and formalized. I am afraid Buddhism is hollowing out." On the level of personal experience, many ordained women observed that although the role of a cleric is the same for women and men, they are treated differently. That is, their social environment makes a difference between male and female priests. As women, they said, they are considered easier to talk to, so people approach them with everyday problems and ask for their advice. In these women's experience, ordained men are viewed as more erudite and scholarly than ordained women, often as more suitable to fulfill the work of a priest, sometimes as more impatient and strict, and as inappropriate exchange partners for women's problems related to family relations, birth, and sexuality. The perceived effect is an atmosphere of familiarity and closeness in interaction, in distinction to the distance felt towards ordained men. Hence, gender-specific role images, as expressed in these cases, are imposed on ordained women. They result from gendered perceptions within society. Here's another example from an interview with Ijima Kedo. That's right. I believe there's a difference in how people approach a male and a female head priest. If it's a male head priest, somehow people are careful to be polite, not to upset him. They flatter him. But with a female head priest, because it's easier to have a casual, everyday conversation, they treat us in a very friendly way, and I'm happy about this. But, well, it would also be nice to be treated a bit more like a male head priest, like someone superior, to be approached more carefully. The third dimension that was mentioned in my interviews is that of individual skills, inclinations, and living circumstances. For Kusano Myoke, a Nichiren Buddhist head priest of a temple in Guma Prefecture, finding one's own way of being a cleric is the most important task. I quote, "I think my role is to first of all do what only I can do. It's easy to tell people what is written in the scriptures. Actually, I don't think it's easy to tell people what is written in the scriptures. It's easy to tell people what is written in the scriptures, but if a cleric's task were only to convey the teachings, well, in a sense, it would be reduced to mere work. Personally, I think a cleric's role, a cleric's way of living should be like an example. It is great if we become role models." Then I asked, "Do you think so?" And she said, "Otherwise, I think it's a lie." Then again, my question. So you think a cleric's role is not only to conduct ceremonies, rites, and funerals, but more in their everyday actions and approaches? Yes, many clerics think it's enough to conduct memorial rites, and many will come to perform a funeral when they are called. But being aware of what only you can do, realizing it in your way of living and conveying what you consider important, that's what I call a Sangha. She herself created a card set with short quotes from the Lotus Sutra. These phrases are interpreted by her own comments about their meaning for everyday life, as well as by a more scholarly explanation of their doctrinal content. Other examples include the purpose to pursue scholarly research about the respective school, or the use of artistic skills as a means to spread Buddhist knowledge. Coming to the conclusion. In modern and contemporary times, the situation of Buddhist nuns is defined by the regulations of each Buddhist school and by their personal background. The legal right to get married and have a family contributed to the diversification of ordained women's lifestyles. Although the same accounts for ordained men, married clerics face a double standard. Whereas male priests are often expected to get married in order to secure their successor as head priest, female priests or nuns are rather expected to remain single because their tasks as mother and wife are seen as a hindrance to performing their priestly functions. Another effect of the temple inheritance system is that for ordained women and men coming from a lay background, it is often difficult to obtain the position of a head priest. Therefore, ordained women engage in a wide range of non-ritual activities, as you will hear in a minute from Midorikawa-san. Although the legal status of all ordained women and men who have completed the ordination is equal, women are often treated differently because of their gender, be it within their Buddhist schools or in interaction with the surrounding society. The intersection of religious role and gender role leads to the imposition of gender stereotypes on ordained men and women, thus undermining the de jure gender equality claimed in most Buddhist schools. Attempts to dismantle the boundaries between Buddhist women who live in diverse circumstances are the activities of various associations such as ILAB or the Women and Buddhism Networks. They bring together ordained and lay Buddhist women in order to create solidarity, irrespective of their school, their position or rank, and their marital status. In my eyes, these associations and networks play a vital role in establishing a shared sense of being a Buddhist ordained woman, be it in Japan or beyond these national borders. Thank you very much for your attention.